apologies not being there. I'm currently actually on holiday in Norfolk. So hello. But yeah, so I am a senior research associate at the University of East Anglia. And I am currently working on continuing my work in historical kind of like events in the Caribbean and how this translates into vulnerability and risk and so on today. But before I get into that, it all started really with my PhD. So my PhD at the University of Hull was exploring more of the historical and social contexts of the eruptions of La Soufrière in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So I was looking at the 1812 eruption that happened during slavery era, 1902, which was post-emancipation, and then 1979, which was on the eve of the islands gaining independence from Britain. And this definitely was an evolving kind of like project in finding out, actually really understanding that the societal makeup of society, the role of colonialism actually turns these eruptions into disasters. So La Soufrière in itself, if those who don't know, is a large volcano on a tiny island of St. Vincent in the Eastern Caribbean, volcanic arc. It's one of the most active, erupting as recent as last year. I could talk a little bit about that as well later. But this volcano is it's quite typical in the eruptions it produces, and what the hazards it produces are quite typical, and they're very well constrained by topography. So essentially, of course, there is still gaps in our knowledge in terms of the geological record. Most of the hazards, we do know where they go. So this is definitely definitely one of the main points, in that even though there's still gaps in our knowledge, we do understand what La Soufrière is capable of. And this is looking to the historical eruptions. So the 1812 eruption, as I mentioned, happened during slavery. So this was definitely constrained by the fact that those lower down in the social hierarchy created by British colonialism, they had less mobility in terms of social and political mobility. And slaves were the ones who majority died in this eruption. And with that, it definitely was a new experience for the populace, because the last eruption before that happened in 1718, when it was not occupied, mainly because of the resistance of the indigenous peoples that resisted occupation. But by 1812, we had larger sugar plantations actually in operation around near the volcano. And this definitely led to a physical risk presence, that people just being there in this environment close to this volcano actually put them more at risk. Then, of course, there is the complications of vulnerability. I mean, of course, we can have a totally different discussion about vulnerability, and particularly during slavery, where obviously oppression made it more kind of defined vulnerability in different ways. But essentially, it was a new experience for that population, because the colonists would come from areas that did not have volcanoes, and most likely the enslaved Africans that were taken from Africa may have not actually lived in a volcanic environment. So it was a new experience. And the main issues with that, in terms of the disaster, was that it was about trying to get back to the status quo as soon as possible after the eruption had ended. It was about needing to get those sugar plantations that were impacted by the eruption straight back into production to meet the demands of the British Empire in producing sugar and its byproducts. So this actually led the area in north end of the island, essentially their risk and their vulnerability did not change, even though it was post-emancipation and the social structure kind of changed slightly. But in 1902, it was still more of a monoculture, even though the sugar plantation industry was declining, and in competition with sugar beet, it was still dominant. And because it was a monoculture, again, the agricultural industry was impacted again rather severely, and there was lots of problems in terms of trying to recover in terms of the agricultural sector. But the main issue that came up in 1902, which is more evident in the archives I looked at, was the colonial racism present. So in 1902, most of the descendants of the freed slaves, they became kind of like smallholder farmers. And some of them, because of the racism and the need to still control the population, some were still forced to work on the plantations that their ancestors were forced to work on. So they were still at risk. And actually around about 1,300, it was mainly people in that high-risk area, they died mostly on the 7th of May from pyroclastic density currents or pyroclastic flows. And there was lots of, you could see it in the archive records, that basically like they just wanted to sweep their issues away in terms of helping the Black populace and the indigenous populace get back on their feet. It was about helping the absentees, plantation owners financially recover from their losses. It was not about helping the needs of the small farm holders. In 1979, this was a lot better. The social tensions, that even though it was still technically a colony of Britain at this point, the racial issues were not as apparent. The main issue for 1979 was the ash. So the volcanic ash was everywhere, and it did disrupt, but it didn't stop society. But again, they needed help with lots of financial assistance and agricultural kind of like tools and stuff that were lost. But this is where there was lots of outside help in 1979, particularly from the diaspora, and particularly those who had relations to St. Vincent. And this is evidence in the 2021 eruption. And I am writing up a paper about this that I do need to submit very soon. But essentially, 2021 eruption, no one died in this one. It's similar to 1979, but there was an added dimension of COVID. So this was quite a unique situation in that, one thing, my thesis, when I was talking about what may happen if Lassa Feira erupted today, of course, I did not take into account that there'll be a global pandemic. But essentially, no one died in this, mainly because they were very responsive, and the role of the Seismic Research Centre at the University of the West Indies, who monitors Lassa Feira and the other English Caribbean volcanoes. And everyone was responsive. Everyone played their part in terms of helping people, and this definitely made a huge difference. And from outside help, again with the diaspora as well, in terms of providing disaster relief as soon as possible. But of course, I could go on forever in terms of that. It's not as clear cut as it seems, but essentially my whole argument and why I have been very supportive of the No Natural Disasters campaign is because from the archives, from my research, it's very evident that it is down to, well, main thing is people's decisions and what they do when they're under pressure in a crisis. And that could be the difference between people living and dying in sometimes. And it's a continued progress in terms of, I really value the need to look to the past, to look to the present and to the future. So that's my spiel, but I'm happy to take questions later.